Welcome to the Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice. Choice is a publishing division of the ACRL and the publisher of Choice Reviews and CC Advisor. This episode is brought to you by Sage Publishing. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and the editorial director at Choice, and for this 4-episode series, my guests and I discuss essential strategies for not only measuring ROI, or return on investment, but the fundamental principles of displaying that data in a visually appealing way. Academic libraries are increasingly tasked with measuring all kinds of data to justify expenditures across the department, whether for collection development, outreach, or for demonstrating the library's contribution to student success and its value within the institution. In this first episode, our guests and I start off with an ROI explainer, including what it means in the context of operating an academic library, properly communicating ROI values to different constituents, and some of the challenges librarians have with collecting various kinds of data. My guests are Dr. Carol Tenopir, Chancellor's Professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Tennessee, Dr. Stephanie Evergreen, an internationally recognized data visualization and design expert who regularly conducts keynote presentations and workshops and is the author of 2 books, Effective Data Visualization and Presenting Data Effectively, Communicating Your Findings for Maximum Impact, which is now in its 2nd edition. Also joining us is Kristen Tepfer, Executive Marketing Manager at Sage Publishing and the Global Head of the Data Evidence and Reporting Team in Library Marketing. Dr. Tenopir, you consult with academic libraries frequently on a wide range of data-driven questions. I hear all the time that academic libraries are under pressure from within and without to demonstrate value. And in these value conversations, return on investment, or ROI, turns up for topics ranging from the value of collections to student outcomes. A lot of times, though, I feel like we're just talking about ROI in this general sense, where it means something like, what was the outcome? Could you define ROI for us? And how are academic libraries using ROI? And how important is ROI for academic libraries?
Okay, that's a really important question because we hear all the time about the need to demonstrate ROI, and most of the time we really aren't talking about strict financial definition of ROI. Um, in fact, it's kind of dangerous, I think, for libraries to, in a lot of cases. The strict definition, of course, is the money that gets invested in something, like the budget of a library, and compared to the money that the library generates, or that something that gets invested in generates. So it's money given compared to money earned, and it makes sense in the stock market. You will invest $1 million in the stock market, and after a year you might have 1.2 million. So there's a good return on investment. But libraries, a lot of times the value is really an inherent kind of value. It's not a strict money in, money out kind of value. So I think that we really need to think of a softer, most of the time, it's a softer definition. It is really the value that the library brings to students, faculty in the institution, that you can't always put a dollar sign on. So but I should say that there are some times when strict ROI is appropriate. For example, if the library is going to start a development campaign for special collections, and you want to decide how much money to spend on that campaign, and then you have money directly coming in from that, then it works. But for most things, it should be the softer, focusing on value.
Right. Okay. So when you said dangerous, I what I hear you saying is that it's perhaps in many cases not to apply the sort of traditional Wall Street version of ROI to initiatives. It's, as you say, measuring some of the more softer applications.
Yeah, it's ROI, not with capital letters. It's really that's where I prefer to say value, measuring
Yeah.
value to constituents or value to stakeholders.
Okay. Um, so then, Dr. Evergreen, you work with a variety of businesses and nonprofits from local in scale to multinational. Obviously, these folks are reporting ROI too. But I'm wondering if you could talk about using ROI, for example, and maybe the differences in communicating that value to when you're generating a report to say an executive team, or versus what you might communicate to a departmental team, and how those differ, and then really what role visualization might play in each of those scenarios. And are there specific examples maybe that you could share about those?
Sure. So at the bottom line is that everybody is worried about their bottom line, So everybody's ultimately got to answer to the budget. And I think the higher up the chain you go, the more that pressure is on to
Hmm.
to be responsible to the budget. So folks, even though they might feel like there are these more intangible returns on the investment that you were just alluding to, they still want to know like dollars in, dollars out. Um, so I think in terms of like communicating that sort of conversation to different people, for me, it's always about playing to the player and speaking your audience's language. So I think sometimes framing your work in terms of financial return can be beneficial, but sometimes I also see people go too far in the other direction where they get so technical in the math and the terms that they use that it goes over everybody's head. So half the magic in figuring out how to pitch it to different people is just to know where they're at and what they kind of want to hear, like the framing of it that they want to hear.
Okay. And then Dr. Tenopir, I'm just going to kind of throw that back to you. In terms of the hard versus soft approaches to ROI, does that make sense to you in terms of perhaps communicating these results up to deans or presidents versus the library team itself?
Absolutely. I think what we're both saying is that um, different messages for different audiences, but also different ways of measuring value or return on investment or cost benefit, or you have to have a whole strategy depending on the particular service that you're looking at and whether your message and whether your decision making is internal within the library or it's something that you're using to demonstrate value to your internal to the university but external audience like a president or a chancellor. So it's a whole strategy actually of different ways of measuring and demonstrating value.
Okay. And then what about you, Kristen? I mean, your department within Sage provides data to libraries on the use of Sage products across the entire university. So, we're talking not only about library materials, but all materials students and faculty are using, assigning, and so on. But first, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your department. It's pretty interesting. How did it get started?
Yeah. So I've been at Sage for about 13 years, so I've seen a lot of kind of change and growth in this discussion area. But where Sage sort of got started in really looking at data and trying to kind of help librarians look at the data that we were tracking for them better, I would say it kind of started strongly in around 2012. That was the time when we were able to start tracking turnaway information. So that's just where an end user is trying to access a piece of content, download maybe an article or something, and they're turned away because a library doesn't actually own or have access to that piece of content, so it tracks a turnaway. And that was very valuable for librarians to have insight into that when they were considering their purchasing decisions. So as more and more resources were put online, the ability to track this became much more significant and easier to do. So the evidence-based purchasing started to become really a necessity now that we had this data. So early on at Sage, we started to dedicate staff, my team, to consulting with librarians to understand just what data was most important to them. So, for example, faculty interest on their campus was one. And we wanted to make the customer engagement with the data to be just more accessible and easier for them to draw conclusions than just laying big Excel file into their lap. So we created what we call the customer value report, and it's really a visual layout of data that we customize for each institution. And the benefits that we've seen from just reporting data to our library partners like this has been really positive. So one example, a librarian mentioned to me that she sees this report as being an icebreaker to connect to connect the librarians with the busy faculty. So they have something specific. If they have something in that report um, regarding maybe a faculty had trialed a product with Sage and they want to know a little bit more about how they felt about that product, and if they were interested in having it on campus, they have something specific to go to them with. I also thought another creative idea that a librarian shared with me. She wanted to be able to show administration who were actually putting pressure on their faculty to publish, just how much faculty were on that campus were publishing with Sage. It was data that I was able to share with her, and so she positioned it so that they couldn't actually pull any funding from those resources. So she made a case with that data in that way. And then I guess just one last thing that comes to mind is just the peer. We also share information on a campus's, their peer institutions or like institutions around them that are purchasing maybe content from us, and so one librarian actually said that information was really helpful because they said even a provost can understand that is important to know. So being able to share that kind of data with people, with librarians, has been just immensely helpful. And we're continuing to kind of work in that area more dedicated.
Okay, great. So was that sort of a collaborative process in terms of and with the development of the reports? I know you mentioned you do it sort of um, for each of your library customers, but I mean, over the years, was it like you guys determining sort of on your own what was necessary to
It was a
communicate,
little
or
bit of
were you getting feedback from?
Yeah, it was a little
Yeah.
bit of both, really. I mean, I think getting the feedback from the libraries was obviously really important because we wanted to make reports that were useful to them. At the same time,
Right.
we had a lot of available data that they probably didn't even know existed with their publisher, and that we were finding
Mm.
creative ways on our own to kind of start sharing and bringing to their attention. So it was kind of
Yeah.
a somewhat collaborative, yes.
Good. So when you share these reports initially, what are some of the things that usually jump out at your the librarian
Yeah,
customers?
so librarians, as administrators on their accounts with Sage, they are already able to pull, usage and turn away information and things like that on their own, but it's coming out
Hmm.
as raw
Hmm.
data. So our reports offer them just, a lot more insights and summaries. So we show them their usage over time, and we show them their turnaways in key discipline areas, really kind of drawing out trends for them. And one piece of, like I mentioned, I think before, a piece of data that we have that's really interesting to librarians is the faculty engagement. So I mentioned the product trials, and if there's any feedback on those. Also textbook adopters. So I've actually delivered a report on campus where their eyes kind of lit up when I started sharing what textbooks their faculty were adopting from us, and some of the main disciplines they were doing that in, because that allowed them to kind of look at our suite of online resources and see, was there anything that might complement the use of that textbook in the classroom. And they don't have access to that data. They don't have access to what the textbooks faculty members are adopting. So they always perk up to that. And as far as any sort of challenges, though, like data visualization, and it's becoming more of an expectation from the upper management in libraries. So many of the librarians are not trained on presenting data in this way. So they're really grateful to have the support from a publisher to kind of convey this data for them.
Is that because they're wanting to see data quickly and understand it quickly, and that kind of thing? Or
Yeah. I mean, that's
okay.
definitely one of the things. I mean, one of the challenges they've mentioned is the time that it takes and the resources that they have to have on campus to be able to collect all this data. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
they're collecting data across many different publishers that have many different systems and ways that they're collecting the data. So I had one librarian tell me it takes one full-time librarian. It took her 3 days to download all of the publisher data, and then it's another 3 or 4 days to compile it and make the data speak to each other and then create
Right.
visuals. And so the time spent is just getting immense. I mean, they've mentioned having to hire actual staff just to do this kind of work. So
Right.
we're trying to help them kind of take a little bit of the load off, at least from Sage's perspective.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Tenopir, I mean, is this sounding familiar to you? I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about the state of data organization at academic libraries as you see it. Not researcher data necessarily, but library data like gate counts and checkouts and surveys. Um, and then are you seeing any sorts of best practices for organizing that data that are beginning to be adopted, similar to what Kristen was just describing, and maybe some other pain points that you might be seeing as well?
Yeah, I think that this idea of usage data is probably the most used in libraries, even though it's difficult, and lots of them are hiring assessment librarians. That's a really fast growing area in the library, is an assessment librarian, who that is the main purpose of that. There is a ARL assess listserv where folks get together and exchange ideas, which is useful too. But this idea of cost benefit, that is getting the data from the publishers and being able to look at things like which resources are being used more, and then you can actually calculate cost per use, has been something that a lot of libraries are doing. It helps with collection decisions. It helps librarians ask deeper questions. Why are some resources used more than others, and is amount of use the only judge? Or you have to normalize it by size of department, for example, number of faculty, number of students. So it's the beginning of the process, but that process wouldn't even begin if they didn't have these kind of data. So it has really been the last 15 years or so, when counter compliant standards came into being, that even has allowed this to happen. And so libraries are using it a lot, but it is, even with standards, it still takes a lot of effort, but it's worth it, because one question and one answer leads to the next question and the next answer. You get a really good feel of who's using your collection, how much particular resources are cost, what's the cost per use, what's the value to the particular faculty and students in departments. So I think that that's something that's become a real part of what an academic library needs to do and does do.
You just heard from Carol Tenopir, Stephanie Evergreen, and Kristen Tepfer. This concludes the first of our 4-part series on how academic libraries can effectively track and present ROI data. This episode was brought to you by Sage Publishing. Be sure to join us for the next episode, where we'll talk about the basics of data visualization.
We all need the time and space to not just figure out how to get the data in the right shape and in the same place so that we can visualize it, but we've got to have the space to think about what the data are telling us. Like, what's the story here? Because whenever we're communicating this out to somebody else, they're going to want to know, so what? What's the meaning here? What's the point? What are you trying to say?
Find all of the episodes of The Authority File on your favorite podcast app or on our website, choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship dropdown. On choice360.org, you'll also find information on Choice's entire product platform, including Choice Reviews, CC Advisor, Choice Webinars, resources for college libraries, our white papers, and a whole lot more. A great way to keep up with the Authority File is to join the Choice Authority File Facebook group, which you can access via the Choice Reviews Facebook page. As a member of the group, you can give us feedback, suggest podcast participants, chat with other listeners, and submit new topic ideas. Sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, And all of our episodes are produced by Choice's digital media specialist, Mark Dirks. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.